In a peaceful village surrounded by towering oak trees and rolling green hills, an old shoemaker named Tobias lived in a tiny cottage with his wife, Martha. Tobias had once been the most skilled shoemaker in town, known for crafting the finest shoes. But times had changed. People now bought cheap shoes from traders, and fewer customers came to his shop. One evening, Tobias sat hunched over his wooden workbench, staring at the last piece of leather he had left. His hands were calloused from years of work, but now they trembled with worry. If he couldn't sell this pair of shoes, he wouldn't have enough money to buy more materials. Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Things will get better," she whispered. Tobias sighed, cutting the leather into precise pieces and laying them out on the table. The candle beside him flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Too tired to work, he decided to finish in the morning. He blew out the candle and climbed the creaky wooden stairs to bed, unaware that magic was about to unfold in his tiny shop. As the village slept beneath a sky dusted with stars, something extraordinary happened inside the shoemaker's workshop. The heavy wooden door creaked open, though no one touched it. Then, from the moonlit shadows, 4 tiny figures scurried inside. 3 were elves, small, nimble, and mischievous. But leading them was Oliver the gnome, a wise and kind-hearted little creature dressed in a deep green tunic with a red hat. Oliver was not like the others. While the elves chatted excitedly, eager to begin their work, Oliver examined the shoemaker's table. "This man is kind," he whispered. "He has worked hard all his life. Let's help him." The elves nodded eagerly, and together they set to work. Their hands moved with impossible speed, cutting, stitching, and shaping the leather into the finest pair of shoes ever seen. Oliver, being the wisest, carefully checked their work, making sure every stitch was perfect. By the time the first golden light of dawn crept over the hills, the shoes were finished, flawless, polished, and ready for sale. As quickly as they had arrived, Oliver and the elves vanished into the shadows, leaving behind no trace of their visit except for their remarkable handiwork. The next morning, Tobias stretched and yawned as he entered his workshop, expecting to see his unfinished work from the night before. Instead, he froze in place. There, on his workbench, sat a pair of shoes, so perfect, so exquisitely crafted that he could hardly believe they were real. The leather was supple, the stitches flawless, and the shine so brilliant that they looked fit for a king. He turned them over in his hands, examining every detail. "How? Who?" he stammered. Martha hurried into the room when she heard his gasp. She, too, was stunned. "Did you do this in your sleep?" she asked. Later that day, a wealthy merchant passed by the shop and caught sight of the shoes in the window. He rushed inside, barely able to contain his excitement. He paid Tobias a generous sum, more than enough to buy new leather. Tobias and Martha were overjoyed, but a question lingered in their minds. Who had created the shoes? Night after night, Tobias left cut leather on the table, and every morning, a new pair of perfect shoes appeared. His business flourished, and he and Martha were able to afford warm food and even new clothes. But Tobias could not rest until he solved the mystery. One evening, instead of going to bed, he and Martha hid behind an old wooden cabinet in the workshop. They waited in silence, their hearts pounding with anticipation. At midnight, the door creaked open, and Tobias held his breath. Out of the shadows, Oliver the gnome and the 3 elves appeared. They moved swiftly, hopping onto the table and getting straight to work. Oliver nodded approvingly as the elves stitched and polished. Tobias and Martha's eyes widened. These tiny creatures had been helping them all along. But then, Tobias noticed something. The elves' clothes were old and tattered, full of holes, and their tiny feet were bare against the cold wooden floor. Even Oliver's green tunic had patches. A lump formed in Tobias' throat. These little beings had helped him when he had nothing, yet they had so little themselves. He exchanged a glance with Martha, and she nodded. They silently made a decision. They would repay the elves and Oliver for their kindness. Tobias and Martha could hardly sleep that night. The sight of Oliver and the elves in their tattered clothes and bare feet weighed on their hearts. These magical beings had helped them when they had nothing, yet they lived with so little. Determined to show their gratitude, Tobias and Martha spent the next day gathering materials. Tobias selected the softest fabric he could find, while Martha carefully stitched tiny clothes, a deep green tunic for Oliver, and warm little coats, hats, and boots for the elves. Tobias, using the finest leather, handcrafted miniature shoes with expert precision, ensuring they were comfortable and strong. That night, instead of laying out pieces of leather, Tobias and Martha carefully arranged the tiny outfits on the workbench. Then, they hid behind the old cabinet once again, waiting eagerly for midnight to arrive. As the clock struck midnight, the door creaked open once more, and Oliver the gnome and the three elves appeared. They hopped onto the workbench, ready to start their usual work, but then they froze. Where the leather should have been, they found tiny, beautifully sewn clothes and boots, perfectly sized just for them. Oliver was in surprise, his twinkling eyes filled with warmth. The elves, usually mischievous and energetic, stood still, their mouths slightly open. They carefully touched the fabrics, marveling at the softness of their new clothes. One elf held up a pair of boots, his eyes wide with wonder. Another tried on his coat, spinning around happily. Oliver let out a hearty chuckle, his deep voice warm and full of gratitude. He pulled on his new emerald green tunic, smoothing the fine stitching with admiration. The elves, now dressed in their new outfits, danced with joy, their tiny boots tapping against the wooden table. From their hiding place, Tobias and Martha watched with happy tears in their eyes. The elves held hands and danced across the workbench, their little boots making happy tapping sounds. They twirled and leaped, celebrating their wonderful gifts. Oliver, standing proudly in his new tunic, gave a deep bow toward the shoemaker's hiding spot, his wise eyes shining with gratitude. Then, with a final twinkle in their eyes, Oliver and the elves turned toward the window. They climbed up swiftly, their movements light as air. The elves disappeared first, their laughter like the soft chime of bells. Oliver turned once more, as he looked around the workshop, a knowing smile on his face. Then, with a final wink, Oliver leaped from the windowsill and vanished into the night. Tobias and Martha rushed to the window, but there was no sign of them, only the quiet village under the moonlit sky. The next morning, the shoemaker and his wife felt a warmth in their hearts unlike any they had ever known. Though Oliver and the elves were gone, their presence had left a lasting magic in the shop. Tobias continued his craft, and from that day on, every shoe he made carried a little bit of the elves' magic. Customers swore that his shoes never wore out, never hurt their feet, and always brought them happiness. His business flourished, and soon he had enough to hire young apprentices, teaching them the old ways of shoemaking. But no matter how much success he had, Tobias never forgot the tiny hands that had helped him when he had nothing. Sometimes, on winter nights, when the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, he would swear he could hear the soft laughter of elves in the wind, and perhaps even the deep, wise chuckle of Oliver the gnome. And deep in the forest, far beyond the village, Oliver and the elves sat by a glowing fire, wearing their fine new clothes, smiling as they watched the stars. As Tobias' business flourished, the townspeople became curious. How had an old shoemaker, who was struggling just weeks ago, suddenly begun crafting such fine shoes? The quality was so perfect, so magical, that whispers began to spread. A wealthy nobleman sent his servant to buy a pair, and upon wearing them, he declared them the most comfortable shoes in the kingdom. Soon, royalty and merchants from distant lands came to Tobias' shop. But Tobias, though grateful, never revealed his secret. Instead, he continued working with a grateful heart, always remembering his unseen helpers. High in the dense forest, hidden among the ancient trees, Oliver the gnome sat on a moss-covered rock. The elves gathered around him, peering into a magical pool of water that reflected the shoemaker's shop. They saw Tobias and Martha, now prosperous and happy, sharing their good fortune with the village. Oliver smiled, his heart warm with joy. "He remembers our kindness," he murmured. The elves cheered. Though their work in the village was done, they knew they had left behind something far greater than shoes. They had changed a life. As Tobias' shop prospered, he decided to give back. With his newfound wealth, he hired apprentices, teaching them the craft of shoemaking. Many were young villagers who had no trade, and soon, the entire town thrived because of the shoemaker's kindness. Tobias also made free shoes for the poor. Whenever he saw a child with bare feet, he would smile and say, "A good pair of shoes can take you far." He never forgot what it felt like to struggle, and he never let greed take over his heart. Back in the enchanted forest, Oliver and the elves faced a new challenge. A greedy goblin named Grimlock had been watching them and had heard of the shoemaker's success. Grimlock was jealous. He wanted magical shoes for himself and planned to capture the elves to force them to make shoes only for him. One night, as Oliver and the elves sat by their glowing fire, Grimlock's shadow crept closer. As the elves slept, Grimlock struck. Using a net woven from enchanted spider silk, he snatched the elves and stuffed them into a wooden cage. Oliver, startled by the commotion, tried to stop him, but Grimlock's magic froze him in place. "You'll make any magical shoes now," the goblin cackled before vanishing into the darkness, dragging the caged elves with him. Oliver struggled against the invisible force holding him still. He could hear the goblin's wicked laughter fading into the darkness as he dragged the poor elves away. But Oliver was no ordinary gnome. With a deep breath, he focused his mind and whispered ancient words of magic. A soft golden light shimmered around him, breaking Grimlock's spell. He stood up, brushing off his tunic, his eyes now filled with determination. He had to save the elves before it was too late. He quickly gathered his enchanted tools and set off into the deep, shadowy forest, following the faint trail left behind by the goblin's hurried footsteps. Oliver moved swiftly through the night, his small feet barely making a sound as he followed the goblin's trail. The footprints led him deeper into the mountains, where the air grew colder and the trees twisted into unnatural shapes. As he climbed higher, a storm began to brew. The wind howled, and the distant growl of thunder echoed in the valleys. But Oliver pressed on, his heart set on saving his friends. At last, he saw it, a dark cave entrance, flickering with a light of torches. This was Grimlock's lair. Oliver tightened his belt, adjusted his tunic, and prepared for what lay ahead. Oliver slipped into the goblin's lair, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. Inside, he saw Grimlock sitting on a throne of stolen treasure, watching as the three frightened elves were forced to make shoes from dark magic leather. Around them, a group of hulking trolls stomped their feet impatiently, waiting for their turn to get enchanted shoes. Oliver narrowed his eyes. He needed a plan. He carefully reached into his satchel, pulling out a small vial of enchanted dust. It was time to trick the trickster. Oliver stepped forward confidently, surprising Grimlock. "If you want real magic shoes," Oliver said, "you need the finest pair made by my own hands." Greedy as he was, Grimlock agreed. Oliver pretended to work, but instead of making regular shoes, he stitched a powerful enchantment into them, a curse that would make Grimlock dance uncontrollably the moment he put them on. When Oliver handed him the shoes, the goblin eagerly slipped them onto his feet. At first, nothing happened. Then, his feet started tapping, then jumping, then spinning wildly. Grimlock spun faster and faster, his eyes wide with panic. The elves cheered as they saw the goblin losing control. With one final twist and leap, Grimlock went flying through the air, straight toward the cave exit. He tumbled down the mountain, landing with a great thump in a soft pile of leaves. His trolls, now leaderless, panicked and ran away, disappearing into the night. The elves were free at last. With the goblin defeated, Oliver and the elves began their journey back through the forest. The night was filled with glowing fireflies and the soft hoot of owls as they walked together, exhausted but happy. As they reached their camp, Oliver lit a warm fire, and they sat together, enjoying the peace of the night. They had faced great danger, but their bond had only grown stronger. Back in the village, Tobias the shoemaker looked up at the night sky. He had not seen Oliver or the elves in a long time, but he somehow felt their presence. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and he whispered, "Thank you." Deep in the forest, Oliver smiled. The shoemaker had been given a second chance, and the elves had been saved. Their story would live on forever.